Welcome to Eros and Exegesis, all about books. I'm your host, Evan Francis Murray, and today we begin an exhaustive descent into one of the most foundational, haunting, and architecturally complex monuments of Western thought, Plato's Phaedo. Now, I just want to make a brief comment about Greek translation, pronunciations, and using fake voices versus my own. For me, it's important. I want this to be done in my own voice because it leaves a legacy. It's something from me. The ideas, of course, when I do these exegeses has a lot to do with research I do, through reading the text and then reading secondary literature, also thinking about my own angles. And I do use AI to help me sort things out and to look things up. And I mean, it's a great tool. But I'm recording my own voice, sitting here with a microphone on my desk, plugged into my computer. And so this is me. This is authentically me. And, the last 5 episodes or 5 episodes I did, there was so much editing. I had to do so much editing, and I've been stuck now in the Phaedo for literally 3 days because I just keep wanting to tweak it. And, I say this word wrong. I pronounce this guy's name wrong. I get stuck on this part, and I'm starting to lose my mind. So the thing is, instead of keep rehashing this over and over again, I just have to let it go. Let it go. I'm just going to read this as I can. I'm going to talk to you as I can. And when I screw up, I'm not editing it. I'm not going to bother with that because this is not an audiobook. This is a lecture format. So that's it. I hit record and I'm going for it. Okay. Now, in this exegesis, we will not merely summarize the text. We're going to be relentless. We will peel back the layers of the Greek text to examine the linguistic nuances, the historical shadows of the Peloponnesian War, and the tyranny of the 30, and the theological resonance of the Pythagorean prison house. We're looking for the fertile zero of the soul, the point where the individual presence vanishes and the universal form begins. The text is not a relic, but a living modality of being. We move from the framed dialogue into the Socratic unchaining, then through the 4 great proofs of immortality, and finally into the eschatological myth and the silence of the hemlock. Prepare yourselves. We are about to witness the moment where philosophy stops being a pursuit and starts being a deliverance. So through 57A through 58C, the frame dialogue and delay. So first, I want you to imagine you're sitting in a small, dark room where the air smells of sweat and excrement and this something metallic, the faint tang of cheap wine. Outside of the city of Athens it's waking to a spring morning, but inside this cell, time is slowed to the pace of a man's breath. The man is 70 years old. He has fought in 3 campaigns, saved the life of a brilliant trader, fathered 3 sons, and spent 30 years asking questions that made the powerful uncomfortable. And today is the day that he will die. We are speaking, of course, of Socrates, and we are speaking of the Phaedo, The Phaedo centers around Plato's account of his master's final hours. But here's the first thing we must understand. Plato was not in the room. He tells us that he was ill, whether that illness was physical or psychological, maybe a fever of grief, the terror that prevents one from watching, one's dear friend drink poison. We cannot and will never know. What we do know is that the Phaedo is an act of creative transfiguration, so audacious that it would shape 2,000 years of Western thought about the soul, the body, and what it means to die well. The journey we're about to make is not a court record or a dry legal transcript. It is not even a direct, unmediated dialogue between Plato and his readers. Instead, it is masterfully constructed as a story within a story. A double-layered narrative that begins and ends with two men, Phaedo and Exegesis, sitting together in the city of Philus years after the event, reflecting on a past that has already become legendary. Exegesis asks, "Were you yourself there with Socrates on the day he drank the poison in the prison, Phaedo, or did you hear about it from someone else?" Phaedo replies, "I was there myself, Exegesis." Exegesis doesn't want to know whether Socrates died or not. He knows that. He wants to know what the man said before his death and how he met it. He complains that no one from Philus goes to Athens much, and the only report he has is that Socrates drank the poison and died. They knew nothing else. Phaedo also explains the long delay between trial and execution. The Athenians had dispatched a sacred ship to Delos, commemorating Theseus' voyage to Crete. When he saved the twice 7 young people and himself, they vowed to Apollo to send a yearly expedition. By law, the city must remain pure once the expedition begins. No execution may take place until the ship reaches Delos, and returns. Adverse winds can prolong this, and as it happened, the ship was crowned by the priest the very day before the trial. This is why Socrates lingered in the prison. Now the ship has returned. The sentence may proceed. 58D through 59C, setting the scene. As we move deeper into the text, we transition from the external frame into the internal atmosphere of the prison cell. This is not merely a list of names. It is a meticulously curated gallery of the Socratic legacy. Plato is providing us with a who's who of the 4th century philosophical explosion. But he begins not with the names, but with the affective state of the witnesses, the crisis. Phaedo describes a psychological phenomenon he calls a topos te pathos, a strange or out-of-place feeling. To understand this, we must look at the Greek concept of crisis, or mixture. Usually the Socratic circle experienced the pure hedon, pleasure of the logos, the thrill of the hunt for truth. Here, however, that pleasure is fused with leipe, pain at the sight of the somatic end of their master. This is the fertile zero in a psychological sense, a state where binary emotions cancel each other out, leaving the soul in a suspended crystalline state of readiness. They are laughing and crying simultaneously, a delirium that Plato suggests is only appropriate response when the temporal meets the eternal. This emotional instability is personified most acutely in Apollodorus, whom we must flesh out first. This is the Athenian circle, the roots of the schools. Apollodorus is often called the madman, manikos. His presence represents the raw, unrefined Eros of the Socratic movement. He is the man who cannot contain his grief, who lacks the philosophical cool of Socrates. In the narrative, he serves as the emotional baseline, if even the most passionate amongst them is witnessing a happy death, the metaphysical victory is complete. Then we see the old guard, Crito, and his son, Critobulus. Crito is the pragmatic anchor of the group, the man of means who tried to bribe Socrates' way out of death in the eponymous dialogue. His presence represents the civic world, the world of property, family, and legalities, now standing helpless before a man who has transcended all three. Among the Athenians, we find Hermogenes, the brother of Callias. Historical Hermogenes is a vital link. He is the man who provided Xenophon with the details of his own apology of Socrates. His presence ensures that the historical record is being kept. Alongside him stands Antisthenes, a figure of immense importance for our exegesis. Antisthenes would go on to found the Cynic school. He is the bridge between Socratic ethics and the radical aestheticism that views the body as a mere vessel to be mastered or ignored. When we later discuss the soul's practice for death, it is through the lens of Antisthenes' future philosophy that we see the practical application of these ideas. We also see Thesippus, the Paeanian, and Menexenus. Thesippus is the fiery, somewhat irreverent youth we know from Euthydemus. His presence reminds us that Socratic method was not just for the elderly or the aesthetic. It was a sport for the spirited youth of Athens. And going now to the foreigners, the intellectual diaspora. Plato then widens the lens to include the foreigners, signaling that the death of Socrates is a pan-Hellenic event. First, we have Simmias and Cebes of Thebes. These are our primary interlocutors for the duration of the Phaedo. We must understand them as Pythagoreans. Pythagoreans, yes, students of the philosopher Phileas. They bring with them a specific theological baggage, the belief in the soul as a harmony and the body as a prison house, a sema. Their presence is the reason the Phaedo is so mathematically and cosmologically focused. They are not looking for comfort, they are looking for a demonstration. From Megara, we see Euclides and Terpsion. Euclides is the founder of the Megarian school. He represents the Eleatic side of the Socratic inheritance, the obsession with the one, and the rigorous logical paradoxes that would later influence the Stoics. The fact that they walked from Megara to Athens underscores the magnetic gravity of this final hour. The power of absence, Plato and the hedonists. Finally, we must address the gaps in the room through 59b and 59c. Phaedo remarks, Plato, I believe, was ill. This is one of the most debated lines in Platonic literature. By placing himself outside of the room through illness, Plato achieves an authorial fertile zero. He is claiming that what we are reading is not a transcript, but a philosophical reconstruction. The illness is also a literary marker of the trauma. The soul of the student was literally sickened by the death of the teacher. In sharp contrast to this sacred absence is the absence of Aristippus and Cleombrotus, who were off on the island of Aegina. Aegina was a resort, a resort of sorts, I suppose, a place of pleasure. Aristippus was the founder of the Cyrenaic school, which taught that physical pleasure was the chief good. By noting that the hedonist was off on an island while the master was drinking hemlock, Plato is firing a silent but devastating shot. The man who lives for the body cannot face the death of the body. This, then, is our stage. A room filled with the founders of Cynicism, Megarianism, and Pythagoreanism, all watched over by the ghost of the sick Plato, while the hedonists are absent. The scene is set for the most important defense in the history of thought. Not a defense of life, but a defense of the soul itself. 59D through 60A, entering the prison. Phaedo relates their habit of gathering early at the court near the prison, waiting until the doors opened. That morning they met even earlier because the evening before they had learned the ship had returned. When they arrived, the doorkeeper told them to wait. The 11 are unchaining Socrates, he said, and are giving instructions about how he is to die today. Then he bade them enter, and they went and took in the scene. Socrates, just released from his bonds, and Xanthippe, his wife, sitting beside him holding his little child. 60A through 61C, Socrates unchained. Once Xanthippe saw him, she cried out the sort of thing women usually say. "Oh, Socrates, your friends will be speaking to you now for the very last time, and you to them." Socrates glanced at Crito and said, "Have someone take her home, Crito." Some of Crito's people led her away, crying and beating her breast. Socrates sat up in the bed, bent his leg, rubbed it with his hand, and as he rubbed it said, "Gentlemen, this thing which we call pleasure seems to be so strange. It is so extraordinarily related to pain, though this appears to be its opposite, for the two tend not to come to a person at the same time. Yet if someone pursues one and obtains it, he is almost always compelled to take the other, as though the two were joined to a single head. And it seems to me that if Aesop had thought about this, he would have made up a fable that the god wished to reconcile their strife. But as he was unable to do so, he fastened their heads together. And that is why one arises in someone, the other also one follows after it. It seems that this is what has just happened to me. After the pain in my leg, on account of the chain, the pleasure now appears to follow." Cebes then asked about the rumor. Why had Socrates, for the first time, been composing verses in prison? The fables of Aesop set to verse in the hymn to Apollo? Evenus had asked him, and Cebes wanted an answer. Socrates replied, "Tell him the truth, Cebes. I did not compose these works with a view to rivaling him or his poems. No, I knew that would not be easy. Rather, I was testing out the meaning of certain dreams and clearing my conscience in case they were perhaps instructing me to make music in the usual sense." He recounted the recurring dream that said, "Socrates, make music and work at it." Previously, he had assumed it exhorted him to continue philosophy, the greatest music. But once the trial was over and the festival prevented his execution, it seemed safer not to ignore the dream. So he first composed something for the god whose festival season it was, then realized a poet must make stories rather than factual accounts. And since he was no storyteller, he took Aesop's fables, which he knew, and turn the first ones into verse. Tell Evenus this and bid him farewell, and bid him pursue me as quickly as possible if he is of sound mind. I am departing today, it seems, for the people of Athens have given their command. 61c through 64a, the call to death. Simmias objected. Evenus would never willingly comply. Socrates replied, Is Evenus not a philosopher? Then he will indeed be willing, and so will anyone who engages in this activity in a worthy manner. However, he will not do violence to himself, for this, they say, is not lawful. The question of suicide arose. Socrates, now seated with his feet on the ground, which he would stay in place for the rest of the dialogue, explained the ancient account uttered in secret. We humans are under guardianship. The gods are our guardians, and we are among their possessions. If one of your own possessions were to kill itself without your indication, would you not be angry? So it is not illogical to say that someone should not kill themselves until a god sends some necessity, as that happened to Socrates himself. Cebes challenged this. If the gods are the very best guardians, why would the wise be untroubled to leave them? The wise should desire constantly to be in the presence of someone better. Socrates was pleased by Cebes' scrutiny and replied, if he did not believe he was going to various wise and good gods and to men who have died, who are better than those here, he would be wrong to be untroubled. He is not so troubled. He is quite hopeful that there is something for those who have died, and the ancient saying puts it, at least it is much better for those who are good than for those who are bad. Crito interjected and that the poisoner warns against too much heated conversation, compelling a second or third dose. Socrates dismisses him. Let him attend to his own duty and give the poison twice, and if necessary, 3 times. Which leads us now to 64a through 69e. Philosophy is training for death. Socrates now proposes to present an argument as to why a man who has truly spent his life in philosophy is confident when facing death and hopeful of enormous benefits afterwards. Most people are unaware that those who engage properly in philosophy are in pursuit of nothing except dying and being dead. If this is true, it would be strange to be troubled when one finally attains what one has eagerly pursued for so long. Simmias laughed. The many already say philosophers have a longing for death and deserve it. Socrates distinguishes the true philosopher's understanding of death. He asks, do we think death is something? Simmias agrees. It is nothing other than the separation of the soul from the body. The dead state is the body just by itself, separated from soul, and soul just by itself, separated from body. From this, Socrates builds. The philosopher disregards bodily pleasures, food, drink, sex, fine clothing, and directs his attention away from the body as much as possible, toward the soul. The philosopher is the one who frees the soul from communion with the body, but most people think someone indifferent to bodily pleasure is well nigh dead. Yet when it comes to acquiring wisdom, the body is an impediment. Sight and hearing afford no truth. The soul encounters truth only in reasoning, when it is just by itself, fleeing the body. There is just itself, the beautiful itself, the good itself. These are never seen with the eyes or contacted through senses. The philosopher approaches each with the mind alone, making use of pure thought, free from bodily disturbance. As long as we have the body and the soul is compounded with such badness, we shall never satisfactorily obtain what we desire, the truth. The body brings countless distractions, illnesses, loves, desires, fears, imaginings, foolishness. It causes wars and insurrections because of the acquisition of wealth, slaves in its service. Even when we turn to philosophy, the body intrudes, confounds us, and we cannot see truth clearly. Pure knowledge will be attained only when we die, when the soul is separate from the body. The philosophical life is therefore a purification, separating soul from body to the greatest extent possible, accustoming soul to gather itself together, dwell just by itself, both now and hereafter. Death is that freeing and separation. The philosopher practices dying, and of all people, death is least fearful. Would he not be glad to go to a place where he will attain the wisdom he loved? Anyone who grieves at death is a lover of the body, a lover of money or honor, not a lover of wisdom. True courage and sound mindedness belong to the philosopher. Ordinary people are courageous from fear of great evils. They are sound minded from a certain lack of restraint, refraining from some pleasures out of desire for others, controlled by pleasures. This is exchanging pleasures for pleasures like coins. The only proper coin is wisdom, courage, sound mindedness, justice, and true excellence must accompany wisdom. True excellence is a purification, and those who established the mysteries spoke in riddles. The thyrsus bearers are many, but the Bacchae are few. The Bacchae are those who have properly engaged in philosophy. Socrates has spent his life eager to become one of them. So imagine the thyrsus, or the narthex it was called. It's a giant fennel stalk, hollow and light, topped with a pine cone and wrapped in ivy. In the Dionysian processions that snaked through the hills of Greece, thousands of people carried these. They wore the fawn skins, they chanted the songs, they held the staff. They looked for all the world like devotees. But for Socrates, the thyrsus is the ultimate symbol of the somatic facade. It is an external prop. You can hold the fennel stalk without ever feeling the fire. In the context of our exegesis, these are the hobbyists of the mind. They carry the vocabulary of philosophy. They can cite the definitions and perform the rituals of debate, but they remain hollow. The narthex is, after all, the same vessel Prometheus used to smuggle fire. The thyrsus bearer holds the container, but they are not the flame. They are in the parade, and they haven't left the city of the self. Then there are the Bacchae. These are not the people watching the parade or even the ones walking in it. These are the ones who have been consumed by it. To be a Bacchos is to enter a state of enthusiasmos, literally having the god, Theos, inside of you, en, in you. It is the moment of ecstasis, where you step outside the prison of your own ego. While the thyrsus bearer is defined by what he carries, The Bacchae are defined by what they have become. They have undergone the telit, the rite of passage that strips away the titanic or earthly distractions of the body to reveal the divine spark. Socrates is doing something revolutionary here. He is hijacking the language of the irrational cults to describe the most rational of pursuits. He tells his friends that the true Bacchae are none other than those who have practiced philosophy in the right way. He is asserting that philosophy is not a lecture series. When we talk about the fertile zero of the soul, we are talking about this transition from the thyrsus to the Bacchae. The many are content with the somatic, the comfort of the ritual, the safety of the staff, the social identity of being a philosopher. But the few, the true initiates, are those who treat the dialectic as a fire that burns away everything non-essential. As we move into the four great proofs, we must ask ourselves, are we here to merely carry the fennel stalk of Plato's logic? Or are we prepared for the extasis of the argument, the moment where the soul stops carrying the staff and starts becoming the light? Socrates isn't just defending his life. He is inviting us to stop being spectators in the procession and to finally become the mystery itself. 70a through 77e. First proofs, cycle of opposites and recollection. Cebes now voices the fear of most people that when the soul departs from the body, it is dispersed like breath or smoke and is no longer anywhere. Socrates takes up this challenge. He invokes an ancient story. Souls exist in Hades, having gone there from here, and they arrive back here again, coming into being from those who have died. To prove this, he first proposes the cycle of opposites. Everything comes to be from its opposite, greater from lesser, stronger from weaker, just from unjust. Life and death are opposites. The living come from the dead, and the dead from the living. There is no process of dying, but there must be a corresponding process of coming to life again. If generation were a straight line from the opposite to the other with no return, everything would eventually have the same form and cease to be. If there was falling asleep without awakening, everything would make the mythical character Endymions' eternal sleep insignificant, because all would be asleep. Likewise, if everything that partakes of life were to die, and the dead remained that way without coming back to life, eventually everything would be dead. So the living come into being from the dead, and the souls of the dead must exist somewhere for this to happen. Simmias then asks to be reminded of the argument of recollection. Cebes offers a quick version. If people are questioned properly, they describe everything as it is. This would be impossible unless knowledge and correct account were within them. Socrates expands. If someone is to be reminded of something, he must have known it on a previous occasion. Recollection occurs when, upon seeing or hearing something, one thinks not only of that thing, but of something else, the knowledge of which is different. Seeing a picture of a horse can remind one of a man. Seeing a picture of Simmias can remind one of Cebes. Recollection can arise from likes or unlikes, but when it arises from likes, one must also recognize whether the thing lacks anything in respect of its likeness to that which it is recollected. Socrates then applies this to equality. We say there's an equal itself, something different from equal sticks or stones. When we see pieces of wood or stone that are equal, we bring to mind that equal which is different from them. Those sensible equals sometimes appear equal to one thing, but not to another. The equal self never appears unequal. The sensible equals are striving to be like the equal, but are deficient. To recognize this deficiency, one must have had prior knowledge of the equal itself. We must have acquired this knowledge before we began to see and hear before birth. If we acquired it before birth and lost it at birth, then later using the senses, we require that knowledge. We reacquire that knowledge. This is what we call learning. It is recollection. This argument applies not just to the equal, but to the beautiful itself, the good itself, the just, the holy, and all things to which we apply the term what it is. Thus, the soul must have existed before birth, possessing intelligence. Cebes remains only half persuaded. The soul existed before birth, but will it still exist after death? Socrates points out that the cycle of opposites and recollection together supplied the answer. If the soul existed before birth and must come to life again from death, then it must exist after death as well. But Cebes and Simmias are still afraid, like children, that the wind will blow the soul away and scatter it, especially if one dies on a windy day. Socrates assures them they must sing charms to the child within them. He then proposes to investigate what sort of thing is liable to be scattered and what sort is not, and then see to which kind the soul belongs. Let's flesh this out a bit, and I'll start off with a parable. Let's imagine a young apprentice working in a workshop. The master gives him a task. Find me 2 branches from the forest that are exactly the same length. The boy spends all day searching. He brings back 2 oak limbs. He holds them up to his eyes, squinting in the sunlight, and then he sighs. He tosses them aside and says, "These aren't equal. This one has a curve, and that one is a hair too short." The master looks at him and asks a curious question. How do you know they aren't equal? Have you lived your entire life in this forest, in nature? No 2 branches are ever identical. You have never seen, touched, or measured a perfect equality. Every stone you've ever tripped over was unique. Every leaf was different. If you have never seen a perfect same, where did you get the rule you are using to judge my branches as a failure? The boy is a little bit stunned here. He realizes he didn't learn what equal was by looking at the branches. Instead, he brought the concept equal to the branches. He already had the blueprint in his pocket before he even entered the woods. He is using a standard that doesn't exist in the physical world to judge the physical world's deficiencies. In the narrative of the Phaedo, this is the Socratic unchaining of the mind from the senses. Socrates uses the term autos o este, which means that which it is. He is drawing a hard line between the equals, plural, sensible, fluctuating, and the equal itself, singular, noetic, eternal. When we see 2 stones, they might look equal from one angle and unequal from another, but the concept of equality can never be unequal. Therefore, the concept cannot be a summary of our experiences. You cannot build a perfect concept out of imperfect parts. The pivotal move here is the recognition of deficiency. To say that a stick is not quite equal requires you to already process the knowledge of what exactly equal is. If you didn't have the perfect in your mind, you would just see two sticks and accept them as they are. You wouldn't feel that sense of striving or falling short. This feeling of falling short is the soul's memory of the forms acting as a catalyst. This leads us to the heart of the argument. Learning is recovering. If we have this standard in our minds, but we didn't get it from our eyes or ears, and indeed we use it to judge everything we see and hear, then we must have acquired it before we had senses at all. This is the fertile zero of the intellect. We are born into a state of amnesia, the trauma of birth and the overwhelming noise of the somatic body, because it causes the soul to forget the blueprints it saw when it was unencumbered. When we study philosophy, when we do math, or when we simply look at two sticks and realize they are almost the same, we are not learning something new. We are clearing the dust off an old mirror. We are recollecting the pieces of a truth we once held in full. Socrates insists this isn't about geometry or sticks. It applies to the beautiful, the good, the just, and the holy. When you see a sunset and call it beautiful, you are recognizing a deficiency. You are saying, this sunset is a shadow of the beauty I once knew. When you see an act of justice and feel a resonance, you are remembering the just itself. The conclusion is relentless. If the knowledge exists within us and we didn't get it from this life, we must have existed before this life. The soul is not a blank slate written upon by the world. It is a prior intelligence, a traveler that arrived already carrying the absolute. We don't need to fear the death of the body, because the most important part of us, the part that knows the equal and the good, has already survived the transition into the body once before. All right, I hope that helps a bit, because some of these things can get quite complicated. Certain things, when I come across them, I had no idea what it was being said. So that's why I'm offering these renditions of the terminologies. But now we're going to be moving on to 78b through 84b, and this is the affinity argument. Socrates now develops one of the dialogue's most vital metaphysical arguments, something that is compounded and by nature composite. This is liable to be broken up in the same way it was compounded, but if something is uncompounded, it alone escapes this fate. Things that are always the same and unchanging are most likely to be uncompounded, while those that are constantly changing and never the same are compounded. When he turns to the unchanging realities whose existence they have already established in the recollection argument, the equal itself, the good itself, that which each itself is and what is, do these ever admit any change whatsoever? Or does that which of them always is, since it is uniform just by itself, remain the same and unchanging and never admit any alteration in any respect? Cebes agrees that these must remain unchanging and the same. The many beautiful things, by contrast, people, garments, equals of ordinary life, are almost never the same as themselves or one another. The unchanging things are invisible and grasped only by reasoning of the mind. The changing things are visible and perceived by the senses. Socrates then asks, Do we ourselves consist of anything other than body and soul? The body resembles the visible, the mortal, the multiform, the dissoluble. The soul, however, is invisible. When the soul uses the body to consider anything through the senses, it is dragged toward the things that never remain the same. It wanders. It's confused, dizzy, as though drunk. But when the soul considers just by itself, it departs to another realm, to the pure, eternal, immortal, and unchanging. Since it is akin to this, it ceases its wandering and remains always the same, for it is in contact with things of that sort. This condition of the soul is called wisdom. From all of this, Socrates concludes that the soul is most like the divine, immortal, single in form, indissoluble, always unchanging and the same as itself. The body is most like the human, mortal, unreasoning, multiform, and dissoluble, never remaining the same, so it belongs to the body to be readily dissolved, while the soul is entirely indissoluble, or nearly so. When a person dies, the visible part, the corpse, endures for quite some time, especially if the body was in good condition. If embalmed, like the Egyptians, it can last almost entire for a considerable period, even when it decays. Bones and sinews are virtually immortal. How much more, then, must the invisible soul, going to a pure and unseen place, endure? But the soul's fate depends on its condition at departure. If a soul departs pure, dragging nothing of the body with it, having shunned the body in life, and gathered itself into itself as its constant practice, this being the practice of philosophy, the true practice of dying, it will journey to that which is like it, the unseen, divine, immortal, and wise. And there it will live in blessedness, released from the evils of human life, truly spending the rest of time with the gods. But if the soul departs, sullied and impure, having had constant association and concern with the body, interpenetrated by the corporeal, it is weighed down by the heavy, earthy, visible element, and is dragged back into the visible realm. Such souls prowl about memorials and tombs. Shadowy apparitions of souls have actually been seen, images of souls that were not set free in pure condition. These souls are bound again into bodies that correspond to their dominant desires. Gluttons, drunkards, and the insolent become donkeys or similar beasts. The unjust, tyrannical, and rapacious become wolves, hawks, and kites. Those who practice ordinary civic virtue without philosophy return as sociable creatures, bees, wasps, ants, or even into moderate humans. Only the lover of knowledge who has practiced philosophy and departs in an entirely pure condition attains the race of gods. The true philosopher, therefore, abstains from bodily desires, not from fear of poverty or dishonor, but because philosophy takes the soul in hand, fettered and glued within the body, viewing things through the prison of the body, and gently exhorts it to set it free, showing that inquiry through the senses is deceptive. Philosophy persuades the soul to trust only itself, to collect itself into itself, and to believe what it sees by itself alone is true. The soul of the true philosopher does not resist this liberation. It refrains from the pleasures and desires as much as possible, knowing that intense pleasure and pain nail the soul to the body and force it to share the body's opinions. A soul nourished in this way need not fear that on departure it will be blown away and scattered. On to 84C through 88B. Objections. There was a long silence. Socrates appeared to be reflecting. Simmias and Cebes whispered together. Socrates noticed and encouraged them to state their perplexities. Simmias confesses, "In fact, Socrates, to tell you the truth, both of us have been perplexed for some time, one urging the other on and telling him to ask you a question, as we wanted to hear your response. However, we were reluctant to make any trouble, in case it might be unpleasant for you because of the present misfortune." When he heard this, Socrates laughed gently and said, "Oh dear Simmias, I shall certainly have difficulty in persuading other people that I do not regard my present predicament as a misfortune, when I cannot even persuade you to." Definitive knowledge of such matters is either impossible or extremely difficult in this life, but one must not be faint-hearted. The account does not seem entirely adequate. Simmias then presents the attunement objection. An attunement is an unseen, non-physical, entirely beautiful and divine element, an attuned lyre, like an ancient guitar. While the lyre and its strings are physical, compound, earthly, and akin to the mortal, if someone breaks the lyre and severs the strings, one could argue, on Socrates' own principle, that the attunement must still exist, that the mortal must not perish before the divine. But in fact, we think that the soul is like this. The body is tempered and held together by hot and cold, dry and moist, and the soul is a blend and attunement of these elements once properly mixed. If the soul is an attunement, then when the body is relaxed beyond measure or strained beyond disease, the soul, though utterly divine, must perish first. Just as any attunement in sounds or manufactured objects perishes first, while the body's remains can last a long time. How shall we respond? Cebes adds his own objection. He does not think the soul is weaker than the body. Indeed, it is far superior, but he compares the soul to a weaver who wears out many cloaks. The weaver, having woven and worn out many garments, perishes after them, though before the very last one. Each soul may wear out many bodies, weaving anew what is worn away as the body fluxes and perishes while the person is alive. Yet when the soul perishes, it must wear its last garment and perish before that one. Even granting that the soul exists before birth and can be born and die again many times, we still have no proof that it is not eventually destroyed during one of those deaths. The fact is, no one has ever known the particular death that brings the soul to utter destruction. Unless we can prove that the soul is completely immortal and indestructible, anyone about to die must be in constant fear for his own soul. The listeners were deeply unsettled, cast into doubt not only about the earlier argument, but about anything else they might later discuss. 88C through 91B, Interlude, Mythology. Exegesis, hearing Phaedo recount the collapse of the argument, he's overcome with sympathy, a sympathy that itself shows a form of philia stretching from a Pythagorean community in Philus to a prison cell in Athens years earlier. He confesses that the attunement argument has always captivated him, and he now needs a new argument to convince him afresh. This notion tells us there is a bond of trust that ties the listener to a teacher he's never met. Across time and distance, this is a testament to the gravitational pull of Socrates' character. But it is Phaedo's reply that reveals the deepest register of philia. He says he had never been so delighted in Socrates' company as that moment, not despite the crisis, but because of it. He was amazed first by the pleasant, gracious, and admiring way Socrates accepted the young men's arguments. Here was a man, hours from his death, and his response to objections that undermined his entire hope was not defensiveness or irritation, but delight. He looked at Simmias and Cebes not as adversaries to be defeated, but as beloved friends to be cherished. His philia for them was so entire that their honest doubt filled him with pleasure. It was proof that what they were engaging with him as true philosophers, loving the truth more than the comfort of agreement. Secondly, Phaedo was amazed by how keenly Socrates discerned the effect the objections had had on the company. He was not lost in his own thoughts, preparing a rebuttal. He was attending to the souls in the room with the same diagnostic clarity he had used all his life. He saw that his friends were wounded, that they had been strongly persuaded, and now they were disturbed. They were afraid, not just for him, but for themselves, that they might be unworthy judges or that the matters themselves might be beyond human grasp. Socrates discerned all this with the precision of a physician reading a pulse, because he loved them. And third, Phaedo was amazed by how well Socrates cured them. He rallied them as if they were fleeing in defeat and turned them around to follow him and examine the argument together. This was not the cure of a sophist who overwhelms with rhetoric, but the cure of a friend who restores courage, who reminds the faltering soul that the love of wisdom is a shared enterprise and no one fights alone. Then comes the gesture. Phaedo was sitting to Socrates' right on a small stool beside the bed, and Socrates was seated higher. Socrates stroked Phaedo's head and gathered up the hair around his neck. He was accustomed on occasion to play with Phaedo's hair. This small, intimate act is a declaration. Phaedo, we must remember, was a former slave, a young man captured in war and sold, a body without legal standing until Socrates' friends ransomed him at Socrates' request. Socrates had looked at him and seen a soul, had freed him, educated him, and made him a philosopher. Now in his final hours, Socrates touches Phaedo's hair with the familiarity of a father, a deeply caring comrade, an embodied sign that this bond transcends all social categories. The philia between them is not abstract. It is carried in the fingertips that gather the locks, in the shared memory of liberation, in the knowledge that the former slave is now the guardian of the master's story. Socrates then jokes, "Tomorrow, perhaps you will cut off all these beautiful locks, Phaedo." And that's because in the Greek custom, cutting one's hair was a mourning rite. Socrates is acknowledging what is coming with a smile, but also making a wager. "Not if you let me persuade you," he says. "I will cut my hair today, and you will cut those locks if our agreement meets its end, and we provoke unable to bring it back to life." He invokes an oath the Argives once took, not to grow their hair until they had recovered a lost city. In this prison, the argument itself has become a city under siege, and Socrates is enlisting his friends in its defense. He casts Phaedo as Iolaus, the nephew and companion of Heracles, who helped the hero battle the Hydra. "Call upon me, your Iolaus, so as long as it is still daylight." Phaedo replies that he is no Heracles. He is Iolaus, calling upon Heracles. The devotion is mutual, the hierarchy flattened by love. The hero and the helper are interchangeable in the work of philia. And only now, after this caress and this playful vow, does Socrates utter his deepest warning. Let us beware that a particular misfortune does not befall us. Let us not become haters of discourse. The misology he describes as the shadow side of a disappointed philia, just as the hatred of humanity arises from repeatedly placing great trust in people, believing them to be entirely true and sound, and then finding them evil and untrustworthy. So too, the hatred of discourse arises from trusting arguments and being betrayed. The logic of this analogy is not incidental. It is a profound psychological insight about the relationship between love and knowledge. We trust arguments as we trust friends. When arguments fail us, we feel personal betrayal. And that feeling is, if nursed, curdles into a hatred that forecloses all future inquiry. The cure for misology is the same as the cure for misanthropy, the recognition that we are not yet sound ourselves, and that we must take courage to become so. The philia that binds the group together, Socrates' love for them, their love for him, their love for one another, this is the only thing that they can carry that will carry them through the crisis of doubt without succumbing to despair. The argument is not a weapon to be wielded. It is a shared raft in a perilous sea, and they're all holding on together. Socrates then makes a confession that is saturated with the ethos of philia. He says, with disarming self-knowledge, that he is unlikely to be purely philosophical in this moment. He may become keen on victory, like an uneducated debater, but he distinguishes himself. "I am not eager, except incidentally, that what I am saying should seem true to the people here, but that it should seem as true as possible to me." He puts the stakes plainly. If what he says is true, it is good to be persuaded. If nothing awaits the deed, then at least his ignorance will end soon. and his final hours will not be a burden to his friends with his lamentations. He is thinking of them, not himself. His philia extends to sparing them the pain of watching their teacher grieve. And then he issues one of the more radical invitations of the dialogue. Pay little regard to Socrates, and much more regard to the truth. If I actually seem to you to be saying something true, then you should agree. But if not, you should resist with every possible argument, being careful lest in my eagerness I deceive both myself and yourselves at the same time, and depart like a bee, leaving my sting behind. To love a friend in the Socratic sense is to want them to know the truth, even if it contradicts your own most cherished hopes. This is philia purified by philosophy, a love that refuses to demand assent as the price of affection. The sting of the bee is the wound of an argument that convinces but is false. Socrates would rather lose every debate than leave that sting in the soul of his friends. This is the love of a teacher who cares more for his students' intellectual integrity than for his own comfort or his legacy. Thus is the interlude, the philia, that pervades the entire dialogue becomes fully visible. Philosophy is the practice of dying, but it is practiced together. The soul separates from the body, not in isolation, but in a community of friends who hold each other's intellectual lives in their hands, who stroke each other's hair, who vow not to cut their locks until the argument is saved, who refuse to let each other slide into the hatred of reason. When Plato, absent through illness, wrote this scene years later, he was remembering a philia that death could not sever. The text itself is an act of love, a charm sung to keep the child within from fearing the dark, a gift laid at the feet of the man who, by loving his friends well enough to tell them the truth, he taught them how to die. 91b through 95a. Refutation of the attunement objection. Socrates now proceeds. He first points out the contradiction. Simmias accepts that learning is recollection and therefore that the soul existed before birth. But attunement cannot be constituted before the elements from which it is composed. The lyre, strings, and sounds come first. The attunement is established last and perishes first. The two claims cannot both be true. Simmias chooses recollection, which was expounded through a hypothesis worthy of acceptance, while the attunement theory was based on mere likelihood. Socrates then attacks the attunement theory on his own terms. An attunement cannot be in a different condition than the elements it is composed of. It follows them. It does not lead. Yet the soul is constantly found opposing the body's affections. When there is a heat or thirst, the soul draws the body in the opposite direction, away from drinking. When there is hunger, it draws away from eating. It chastises the body with painful processes of gymnastics and medicine, and it talks to desires, passions, and fears as though they were separate entity. As Homer wrote, Odysseus smote his breast and rebuked his heart. Endure, my heart. You have endured far worse. Homer did not think the soul was attunement led by bodily affections. He thought it led and dominated them, being a far more divine entity. Furthermore, if soul is an attunement, then all attunements, being completely what they are, would share the same degree of attunement. No soul would be more or less a soul than another. All souls would be equally good, and no souls could partake of vice. This is contrary to the obvious fact that some souls possess virtue and others vice. Thus, the entombment theory collapses. 95a through 102a. The second sailing theory of the forms. Cebes, however, remains unconvinced. He does not dispute that the soul is more durable than the body, but insists that the durability is not immortality. Socrates pauses for a long time. He says that the question involves comprehensive deliberation about the cause of generation and destruction. He offers to recount his own intellectual journey. When he was young, he was extraordinarily eager for the wisdom called natural philosophy. He wanted to know the causes of why each thing comes to be, perishes, and is. He investigated questions like whether living creatures develop from fermentation of hot and cold, whether thought is blood, air, or fire, and how knowledge arises. But these studies left him utterly blinded. He unlearned even what he previously thought he knew, and he had believed that people grow by eating and drinking, adding flesh to flesh and bone to bone, making the small person large. He had thought that someone appears large because of his head, and that 10 is greater than 8 because of the addition of 2. Now he is far from convinced he knows any of these causes. He cannot even accept that adding 1 to 1 makes 2, because when each was apart, each was one, and their coming together seems a contradictory cause. Dividing 1 also makes 2, which is the opposite cause. Then he heard someone reading a book by Exegesis, which claimed that reason is what sets all things in order and is the cause of everything. He was delighted. He thought reason would order each thing in the best possible manner, and to discover the cause of anything, one needed only to discover what is best for it. He eagerly read Exegesis, hoping to learn whether the earth is flat or round, why it is better for it to be so, and the same about the sun, moon, and stars. But his hope was wrenched away when he saw that Exegesis made no use of reason at all, but assigned causes to air and ether, water, and other oddities. It was like someone claiming that Socrates acts on account of reason, but then explaining his sitting in prison by describing his bones and sinews. Bones hard with joints separating them, sinews tense and relaxing, enabling him to bend his limbs, and citing sounds, air currents, and auditory experiences the causes of their conversation, while neglecting the true cause, that the Athenians decided it was better to condemn him. And Socrates, in turn, decided it was better to sit there and submit to the penalty, because it was more just. His bones and sinews would have been in Megara or Boeotia long ago if he had not thought it more just and noble to accept the city's sentence. To call those material condition causes is absurd. They are that without which the cause could not be a cause, but they are not the true cause. This distinction between the necessary material conditions and the genuine cause, which is the choice of what is best, is one of the most vital metaphysical contributions of the dialogue. Most people grope in the dark, speaking of a vortex or air supporting the earth, and never seek the power by which things are situated in the best possible way. They look for an atlas to hold things together, never realizing that the good and the right bind and encompass. Disappointed, Socrates feared his soul might be blinded if he continued to examine things directly through the senses. He resolved to take refuge in arguments and study the truth of beings in them. He began his second sailing by hypothesizing, in each case, the account he judged strongest, and treating as true whatever harmonized with it. His hypothesis is that there is a beautiful itself, a good itself, a largeness itself, and all the others. If anything else is beautiful, it is beautiful because it partakes of that beauty, for no other reason. This is the safe answer. Beautiful things become beautiful on account of beauty. Large things are large on the account of largeness. He will not be confused by other causes, color, shape, a head, an addition. He will not say that one person is larger than another on account of a head, because that would make the larger larger and the smaller smaller on the account of the same thing, and would make something large on account of something small, like the head. These are absurdities. The only safe account is that things are what they are by participating in their respective forms. Two things are two by participating in duality. One is one by participating in unity. Socrates would leave the divisions and additions to those wiser than himself. He would cling to that safe hypothesis, and if anyone attacked the hypothesis itself, he would ignore it until he had examined whether its consequences were concordant, and would propose a further higher hypothesis if necessary until something adequate was reached. 102a through 107b, the third proof, form, immanence. With this foundation, Socrates now develops his final, most rigorous proof. Simmias is taller than Socrates, but shorter than Phaedo. Both largeness and smallness are in Simmias, but it is not Simmias's nature, as Simmias, that makes him tall. It is the largeness he possesses. The wording Simmias is taller than Socrates does not express the truth perfectly. It is not because Socrates is Socrates that he is shorter, but because Socrates has smallness relative to Simmias's largeness. The large itself never consents to be large and small at the same time. When its opposite approaches, it either departs or perishes. Not only do the opposites themselves not admit one another, but certain things which are not themselves opposites nevertheless always impose a specific opposite form on whatever they approach. And they will never admit the opposite of that form. For instance, fire will never admit coldness and still be fire. It either withdraws or perishes when cold approaches. The number 3 is not the opposite of even, but it always imposes oddness and will never admit the even if it must perish instead. The same holds for all such cases. Now, ask, by the presence of what will a body be alive? Cebes answers, by the presence of soul. Soul, whatever it takes hold of, always arrives bringing life. And what is the opposite of life? Death. So soul will never admit the opposite of what it imposes. Soul will never admit death. But what do we call that which does not admit death? Immortal. So soul is immortal. Then Socrates asks, if what is immortal is also imperishable, then soul is imperishable as well as immortal. The number 3, if it were necessary for the uneven to be imperishable, would be imperishable. If the unhot were imperishable, snow would withdraw intact from heat rather than being destroyed. But does it follow that the immortal must be imperishable? Everyone would agree that God, the form of life itself, and anything else that is immortal will never perish. Since the immortal is also indestructible, the soul, being immortal, must be imperishable too. Therefore, when death comes to a person, the mortal part dies, while the immortal soul departs and goes on its way intact and indestructible. giving way to death. Souls truly exist in Hades. Simmias has no further argument, though he admits a lingering doubt due to human weakness and the magnitude of the subject. Socrates tells him to examine the initial hypothesis still more closely. Then he will follow the argument as far as a human can. 107c through 114e, Ethical Conclusion and Afterlife Myth. If the soul is immortal, it requires care not only for this life, but for all time. There is no escape from evils except to become as good and as wise as possible. For the soul carries nothing to Hades except its education and nurture, which afford the greatest benefit or harm at the very outset of the journey. Socrates then offers his mythic vision. Each soul is led by its daemon to a place of judgment, then journeys to Hades with a guide. The way is not simple. It has many forks and crossroads, as it is evident from the rites and sacrifices of this world. The orderly and wise soul follows willingly. The soul possessed by bodily desires flutters around the visible realm for a long time, and is led away only forcibly and reluctantly by its appointed daemon. Unpurified souls, those who have committed unjust killings or kindred deeds, are shunned by everyone. They wander in utter perplexity for certain periods and are finally borne to their appropriate abode. Pure souls have gods as companions and guides and dwell in the region proper to them. Socrates then describes the true earth. The earth is round and at the center of the universe, held in place not by air or any constraint, but by the homogeneity of the universe itself. It is enormously large, and we who dwell between the pillars of Heracles and the river Phaedo inhabit only a tiny part, living around the sea like ants of frogs or around a pool. There are numerous hollows all over the earth in which water, mist, and air have gathered. The true earth rests in the pure region of the heavens, where the stars are situated. We are unaware we are living in a hollow, like someone living at the bottom of the ocean who mistakes the sea for the sky. If someone could journey to the upper limit of the air, they would behold the true heaven, the true light, and the true earth, which is composed of colors far brighter and purer than ours. Purple, wondrously beautiful, gold, white, whiter than snow, adorned with gems that our pebbles merely imitate, pure and uncorroded by brine and filth. The inhabitants of that region are free from disease and live much longer. They see sun, moon, and stars as they truly are, and the gods truly dwell among them. Beneath the earth, the hollows are interconnected by channels through which rivers of water and mud flow, all surging into and out of Tartarus, the great chasm that spans the entire earth. There are 4 primary rivers, Oceanus flowing outermost in a circle, Acheron flowing opposite, reaching the Acherusian lake where most souls arrive, Periphlegathon, a river of fire and boiling mud and that coils around and discharges into Tartarus opposite, and Cocytus, where forms the Stygian lake in circles in the opposite direction of the Periphlegathon. Souls are judged, and the incurable are cast into Tartarus, never to return. The curable suffer for a year, then are carried along the rivers, crying out to those they have wronged. If they persuade them, they are released. If not, they return to Tartarus until they do. Those who have lived with exceptional holiness are freed from those places and dwell upon the true earth. Those who have purified themselves sufficiently through philosophy live thereafter without bodies for all time, in dwellings even more beautiful. The details may not be exact, But something like this applies to our souls, and we should chant these things to ourselves as charms. 114e through 118a, the final moments. Socrates now prepares for the bath, so that the women will not have to wash a corpse. Crito asks for instructions about his children or burial. Socrates says only, "Care for yourselves, and you will serve me." Asked how he should be buried, Socrates laughs gently. "Any way you like, if you can catch me and I do not escape you." He explains that he is not the body that Crito will soon see as a corpse. He will depart to some delights of the blessed. Crito must not say at the funeral that he is laying out Socrates or burying him. Those are improper words that harm the soul. He must take heart and say he is burying Socrates' body. Socrates bathes, speaks with his children and the women of his household, then returns. The sun is nearly setting. The servant of the 11 arrives, a man who has come to admire him. The servant says, "Socrates, I shall not find in you the fault I find in others, who are angry with me and curse me when I order them to drink the poison. During your time here, I have known you as the noblest, gentlest, most excellent man who ever arrived in this place. So try to bear that what must be as lightly as you can." He weeps and departs. Socrates praises his courteousness and asks that the poison be brought. Crito urges delay. The sun is still on the hills. Others have drunk late, feasting and fraternizing. Socrates replies, "It is quite reasonable for them, for they think there is benefit in doing so. But I think there is no benefit in drinking a little later, apart from becoming a figure of fun to myself by clinging to life and sparing what is already spent." He insists. The servant returns with the poisoner, carrying the cup already pressed. Socrates asks what he should do. The man says, "Just drink it and walk about until your legs become heavy, then lie down." Socrates takes the cup most graciously, without fear or any change of color or expression. He asks, "What do you say about pouring a libation to someone from this cup? Is that permitted or not?" The poisoner replies, "Socrates, we only press the amount we think you need to drink." Socrates says, "I understand. But is it permitted and indeed necessary to pray to the gods that my change of abode from here to there will be graced with good fortune?" He puts the cup to his lips and very calmly, without flinching, he drinks it down. Up to then, most had restrained their tears, but seeing him drink breaks them. Phaedo himself weeps in torrents, hiding his face. Apollodorus wails and grieves that none can help breaking down, except Socrates. "Strange men," he says, "what a way to behave. I sent the women away mainly so that they would not cause such a tumult. I have heard that one should die in reverent silence. Keep quiet and endure." They feel ashamed and they stop. Socrates walks around until his legs become heavy. Then he lies flat on his back as instructed. The man who administered the poison begins examining him. He pinches Socrates' foot hard and asks if he can feel it. Socrates says no. Then the man feels his shin and proceeds upward, showing them that he is going cold and stiff. He touches him and he says that when the coldness reaches the heart, he will be gone. Once the coldness is near the groin, Socrates uncovers his face and speaks his final utterance. Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt without fail. Crito says it shall be done and asks if there is anything else. To this question, Socrates does not reply. After a short time, he shudders. The man uncovers him and his eyes are fixed. Crito closes his mouth and eyes. Such was the end of their companion, a man whom they would say was the best, the wisest, and the most just of any they had ever known. The city that killed Socrates. But the Phaedo does not float free of history. It was written into and against a particular moment of civic terror. Athens in 399 BC was a city traumatized. The Peloponnesian War had ended in defeat just 5 years earlier, leaving the city walls demolished, its empire dismantled, its self-confidence shattered. The Spartan-backed 30 tyrants, an oligarchic junta that included Critias, a former associate of Socrates and a relative of Plato. They had seized power, and under Critias' leadership, they executed an estimated 1,500 people, often to seize their property. Plato's relative, Critias, is historically notorious for his violence, impiety, and cruelty, even among his own peers. Xenophon suggests that Critias' notoriety directly contributed to the animosity that led to Socrates' own execution. Despite Critias' heinous reputation, Plato often presented him as an educated interlocutor in his dialogues. Charmides, Pythagoras, Timaeus, Critias, suggesting a complex relationship with his relative. Critias was killed in 403 BC, but it is easy to see why the restored democracy of Athens was so jumpy, suspicious of intellectuals who questioned traditional norms and eager to reassert civic piety as bulwark against further chaos. Socrates' association with Alcibiades, the brilliant trader who had defected to Sparta and then Persia, and with Critias, the tyrant, made Socrates extremely politically toxic. His trial was not simply about theology. It was about a city's fear that philosophical questioning undermined civic loyalty. So we find ourselves in that cell. The Phaedo is, in part, Plato's answer to that fear, a demonstration that the philosopher is not a threat to the city's piety, but its truest practitioner. Socrates composes a hymn to Apollo. He obeys a divine dream. He dies with a prayer on his lips and a thank offering of the god of healing. The dialogue quietly insists that the city executed its most pious citizen. The Pythagorean contest. Let us now attend to a fact that is easy to overlook but impossible to ignore once seen. The Phaedo is, in its deepest architecture, a dialogue between Socrates and the Pythagorean tradition. Three of its central figures, Exegesis, Simmias, and Cebes, are Pythagoreans. Exegesis of Phlius belongs to a city known for its Pythagorean community, a school that preserved the teachings of Philolaus, the most influential Pythagorean philosopher of the late 5th century. Simmias and Cebes have traveled from Thebes, where Philolaus had emigrated after the destruction of the Pythagorean centers in southern Italy. They carry with them the doctrines that Pythagoras had whispered behind closed doors. The soul as a harmony, the body as a tomb, the cycle of rebirth, the horror of pollution. They are not mere interlocutors. They are the living representatives of a tradition that Socrates will spend his final hours transforming. This is the first thing we must understand about the Phaedo as a philosophical document. It is not a general treatise on immortality addressed to all humanity. It is a correction of one tradition by another. Socrates borrows the Pythagorean metaphors, the soma sema. The body is tomb, the cycle of metempsychosis, the idea of purification through disciplined living. But he refutes the Pythagorean conclusion. For the Pythagoreans, the soul was a harmony, a tuning of the body's elements. When the body dies, the harmony dissipates. Socrates agrees that the body is a prison. He disagrees that the soul is merely its tune. The entire dialogue in this light is a contest between two visions of the soul, one that sees it as an emergent property of physical arrangement, and one that sees it as an internal substance that pre-exists and outlasts the body. The dialogue thus performs a quiet revolution. It takes a tradition that was whispered in secret initiations, bound by oaths of silence and taboos on beans, and shouts it from the prison yard on the day of death. It turns esoteric cult into public defiance. It transforms Pythagorean mysticism into an argumentative armor, stripping away every comforting illusion so that the reader confronts the stark either or. Either the soul is immortal or everything, justice, philosophy, love itself, is meaningless. The witness, Phaedo of Elis. And what of the man through whose memory all of this reaches us? We know very little about Phaedo from his own writings because none survive. He wrote dialogues in the Socratic manner. We know this from later references, but the texts themselves are lost. What remains is his reputation, preserved in fragments, and the fact that Plato chose him to be the narrator of Socrates' final hours. Phaedo was a young man when he was captured in war and sold into slavery. We do not know the war or the circumstances. What we do know is that Socrates' friends ransomed him, freed him at Socrates' request. Socrates then took the young man under his wing. This is not a minor detail. Phaedo was a slave, a commodity, a body without legal standing. Socrates saw him as a soul. He rescued him, educated him, and turned him into a philosopher. After Socrates' death, Phaedo returned to his homeland of Elis and founded his own school, the Elean school, which focused on dialectical inquiry and ethics. His pupil, Menedemus of Eretria, who would continue the tradition, blending Socratic questioning with training in the soul's discipline. Why does Plato choose Phaedo as the narrator of the Phaedo? The answer is not logistical. Plato could have chosen Crito, who was there, who was present. He could have chosen Apollodorus, whose weeping is so vividly described. But he chose Phaedo, a former slave, a man whose life was a gift from Socrates, a man who then became a teacher in his own right. This is a literary choice of profound significance. Phaedo is a living testament to what Socrates' philosophy does. It frees souls from prisons, not only the prison of the body, but the prison of social death, of slavery, of being treated as a thing rather than a person. Socrates liberated Phaedo from a literal prison, and Phaedo, in return, has become the guardian of the master's memory. Phaedo is not a neutral reporter. He is a witness in the ancient Greek sense of the term. One who has seen, one who can testify, one whose presence transforms the story into testimony. He is now an old man speaking to Exegesis, another Pythagorean in a city that is not Athens. He is framing the event, he is shaping it, and as he speaks, he is aware that he is fulfilling a duty to preserve and transmit not only the arguments, but the manner of the death, the calm, the smile, the ankle rubs, the childlike delight in the freed limb. These details are not ornamental, they are the evidence that the philosophy was real. We must ask then, was Socrates the architect of his own legend? The question is unavoidable, and it is not cynical. It is reverent. Socrates spent his life teaching that the unexamined life is not worth living. He would have examined his own death with the same rigor he applied to everything else. He could have escaped. Crito offered him the means. He could have wept. He could have begged. He could have turned the jail cell into a theater of despair. Instead, he rubbed his ankle and told a fable. He composed a hymn and a poem. He prayed to Apollo. He asked Crito to pay the rooster, I guess it would have been like sacrificing the rooster. He lived his death as he had lived his life, as a philosophical performance, a demonstration of the principles he had spent decades refining. Does this mean the legend is a fabrication? No, it means the legend is earned. The Phaedo is not a transcript of the actual events. It is a memorial, a creative reconstruction, a work of art. But the art is not false. It is the deepest kind of truth, a truth about what a philosophical life looks like when it is lived to its end. Plato did not invent Socrates' serenity. He made it visible. He gave it a shape and a voice. And Phaedo, the former slave, the freed philosopher, the founder of the Elean school, was the vessel through which that shape was delivered to the world. The medical reality and what the Phaedo omits. Let's confront this medical reality together. The active alkaloid in hemlock, conein, produces a biphasic reaction. An initial excitatory phase arrives within 15 to 90 minutes. Intense nausea and vomiting, burning sensations in the mouth and digestive tract, excessive drooling and sweating, tremors, rapid heartbeat, and confusion. As the poison takes full effect, it blocks communication between nerves and muscles. The paralysis is ascending. It begins in the feet and climbs upward. Significantly, conein does not immediately affect the brain. The victim remains fully conscious while the body becomes a prisoner of its own paralysis. The actual cause of death is suffocation. Once the paralysis reaches the diaphragm and chest muscles, breathing ceases. The victim dies aware, unable to move, unable to cry out, unable to do anything but wait for death. If Socrates experienced these symptoms, Plato chose not to record them. The sanitization is itself a philosophical act. It asserts that the truth of Socrates' death lies not in the physiological facts, but in the logos that survived them. The body dies in agony. The dialogue lives. The text asks us to believe that the essential Socrates, the questioning, joking, reasoning self, was untouched by the poison, even if the flesh that housed it was betrayed. Plato, who could not watch his master die, has given him a death that mocks mortal terror, even as it beckons towards transcendence. The Phaedo is not elegy, but, again, it's a resurrection. The Phaedo did not emerge in a vacuum. Plato absorbed, transformed, and overthrew the intellectual currents of late 5th century Athens. The Pythagorean coloring is unmistakable. Simius and Cebes wear it like cloaks. Plato borrows the doctrine of reincarnation and the idea of philosophy as purification. The horror of the body is tomb and the vision of impure souls flapping like bats around graves. Yet he radically transforms the inheritance. The dialogue also engages with pre-Socratic natural philosophy, Heraclitus' cycle of opposites, living from dead and dead from living. This is stabilized and anchored in eternal forms rather than perpetual flux. Empedocles' elemental cosmology lurks in the rivers of the final myth, and Exageras's mind, which promised teleological order but delivered mechanistic ether, is both honored and surpassed by the hypothesis of forms. Plato's critique of the Ionian first sailing is a polemical manifesto against a tradition that glimpsed intellect but shackled it to matter. The Phaedo is traditionally cited as a central work of Plato's middle period, alongside the Symposium and the Republic, while standard scholarship claims it postdates the aphoretic searches of the Laches and Charmides to inaugurate a constructive phase of metaphysics. This chronological view overlooks the dialogue's role in a deeper dramatic initiation. In a pedagogical order, the Phaedo is the culmination of stage 1. This is the introduction that begins with the Ion's confrontation between logic and pride for the sake of entertainment, and the Euthyphro's search for the objective essence of piety. And by following the apology and Crito with the Phaedo, the reader encounters the full weight of Socrates' personality in his inquiry against myriads of illusory knowledge. Even though this represents the end of Socrates' life, it is the essential starting point for those wishing to understand who he was and what he stood for before engaging with the rest of the chronology. This placement transfigures the subsequent stages, and we see Plato's writing in an ontological order, ensuring that the intellectual rigors to come are grounded in the profound insight of a life lived and lost for the sake of the truth. The Academy itself, founded around 387 BC, in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, was Plato's attempt to build the counterpolis that the Phaedo imagined, a community where reason ruled and philosophers practiced dying together rather than alone. The institution endured for nearly 1,000 years, outlasting Athens' democracy, Alexander's empire, and the Roman Republic. Its curriculum, rooted in the Phaedo's vision of purification through mathematics and dialectic, became the template for the Western university. The young aristocrat who watched democracy devour its best citizen would spend the remainder of his life trying to prove that philosophy could survive politics. The Sicilian disasters of his later years, the futile attempts to educate the tyrant Dionysus, the shipwreck, the imprisonment, the failed utopia, were attempts to enact what the Phaedo theorizes, the philosopher healing the tyrannical soul. He failed. The hemlock remained the wound that never closed, compelling Plato to write and rewrite Socrates into immortality, lest the gadfly's sting prove vain, lest the examined life end in silence after all. The Phaedo's influence radiates outward like ripples from the hemlock cup. Plotinus in his Aeneids absorbed the soul's purification and ascent to the One. though he swerved toward mystical union over dialectical proof, critiquing Plato's dualism for insufficient monism, where the Phaedo insists on the soul's separation from the body as the goal of philosophical life. Plotinus longs for a return to the undifferentiated one from which all souls emanate. Yet he never abandoned Plato's text. He lived inside it, commenting and expanding its arguments through the lens of third-century contemplative practice. For Plotinus, the Phaedo was not merely a text to be studied, but a world to be inhabited. Augustine, in his Confessions, climbed the forms as a ladder to God. The prison cell became the pear tree's sin-shadowed garden, and the Platonic immortality was Christianized into the soul's fallen yet redeemable destiny. Augustine read the Platonists in a Latin translation at Milan and recognized them a foreshadowing of the gospel. As he put it, with a certain change of a few words and phrases, the Platonic books spoke of the Word through all whom things were made, of the light that enlightens every soul, of the forms that exist in the mind of God. The Phaedo thus became a bridge. Its argument for the soul's immortality were baptized into Christian theology, even as its contempt for the body was tempered by the doctrine of resurrection. Augustine could accept that the soul survives death. He could not accept that the body is merely a prison to be escaped. Christianity demanded more, the redemption of the flesh itself. Dante's Divine Comedy bears the Phaedo's imprint in its purgatorial circles and ascent to Paradiso. Virgil guides as Simmias and Cebes once questioned. Beatrice replaces Diotima as the revealer of final truths. The Phaedo's myth of the true earth, with its hollows and rivers of moral consequence, these reappear in Dante's stratified afterlife. The terraces of Purgatorio, the circles of Inferno, the spheres of Paradiso. Yet Dante swerves decisively. Where Plato's purified soul escapes the body forever, Dante's blessed receive their bodies back at the last judgment, glorified and transformed. The Phaedo's dualism is corrected by Christian resurrection. Still, the architecture is Plato's. The comedy is, in some sense, the Phaedo rewritten for a Christian cosmos, with the same moral geography, the same graded ascent, the same conviction that philosophy is the practice of dying, but with a God who loves the body enough to raise it. Cicero admired the dialogue profoundly. His Tusculan disputations transmit its arguments to Roman audiences with a lawyer's precision and a statesman's gravity, defending the soul's immortality against Epicurean materialism with weapons forged in the Athenian prison. Cicero read Plato during the darkest hours of the Roman Republic's collapse, and he found in the Phaedo a model of how to face catastrophe with philosophical dignity. The dialogue became, for educated Romans, a manual for dying well in an age of civil war. Seneca, writing to console bereaved friends, quotes the Phaedo alongside Stoic precepts. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius, meditating in his campaign tent, rehearses the Phaedo's arguments against despair. The ancient biographer Dionysius Laertius records the legend that the young skeptic Cleombrotus read the Phaedo and leapt from a wall in ecstatic conviction that death was the soul's homecoming. The literary critic Harold Bloom offers a provocative inversion of the traditional view, characterizing Plato not primarily as a philosopher, but as a strong poet who creatively misinterpreted his own poetic forerunner, Homer, to clear imaginative space for his own vision. In Bloom's reading, the irony of the dialogues is that they demonstrate through the character of Socrates the opposite of what Plato explicitly argues. Socrates is a literary creation, an incarnation of Eros, and a hero akin to Achilles or Odysseus. Socrates is designed to set the pattern for philosophy as a supreme literary art. By Bloom's account, Plato was the most major literary artist among philosophers, refining conversation into an imaginative act that established the very inwardness and self-overhearing that Bloom would later famously attribute to the invention of the human. Unresolved tensions. The Phaedo does not close in its own fissures, and its power partly derives from this refusal. If the soul is truly imperishable, why does Socrates frame the myth as mere likelihood, a charm to be repeated rather than a certainty to be possessed? The admission reveals that reason's safe hypothesis crumbles before mortality's abyss. The proofs are tectonic, yet insufficient without incantatory supplement. The dialogue stages not certainty, but desperate wager. A man of sense, Socrates says, ought to not to insist that things are exactly as I have described them. The philosopher tells himself a noble story on the brink, and the reader is invited to do the same. This is not intellectual honesty, it is intellectual humility. Plato knows that the gap between argument and conviction cannot always be bridged by logic alone. Sometimes it requires what Socrates calls a charm, a repeated story, a myth, a vision that steadies the soul when dialectic reaches its limit. If philosophy demands contempt for the body's sensory deceit, why does Socrates in his final hours reveled in embodied sensation? He's rubbing his freed leg like a child with delight, composing verses at a dream's command, joking about pleasure and pain's yoked heads. The tension is not accidental. Plato's worldview is torn between aesthetic flight and tragic affirmation of corporal existence. The forms glimpsed prenatally remain in life, partially inaccessible. Recollection is shadow play, and the true earth's ether is forever deferred. The text's enduring provocation is that even at death's door, the examined life remains unfinished. The 20th century added its own skepticism. Bertrand Russell dismissed Plato's arguments as fallacious and certainly not valid. Logical positivists found the entire metaphysical edifice meaningless, not false, but without empirical content. Yet even the skeptics kept reading. The dialogue's countercharm persists, not as proof, but as possibility, as the wager that meaning is worth staking against annihilation, even if the stake is lost. In recent decades, Martha Nussbaum has raised a profound ethical objection to this text. She argues that the Phaedo's rejection of the body and its passions demands a cost we should refuse to pay, the cost of human vulnerability, love, and grief. She warns that the soul attempting to escape the body might gain eternity, but it loses the fragility that makes virtue meaningful. In her eyes, a courage that cannot be wounded is not courage. A love that cannot be lost is not love. She accuses the Phaedo of trying to cure us of our humanity by curing us of our mortality. I argue that this critique misses the Socratic middle way. The Phaedo is not a manual for becoming a ghost. It is an ontology of becoming. It describes a directional struggle. The purification Socrates describes is not a final state to be achieved in this life, but a necessary corrective force. Think of the ideal not as a destination, but as a North Star. The sailor does not expect to reach the star, but they use it to ensure the ship is steered by something higher than the shifting tides. This Platonic ideal, the good itself, functions as the philosophical ancestor of the moral law within that Immanuel Kant famously held in awe, juxtaposed with the starry heavens above. This link is the wellspring of the Kantian conception of free will, or autonomy. For both Plato and Kant, genuine free will is not the constrained or unconstrained ability to choose desire or chaos, but the deliberate, rational choice to subjugate the will to self-legislated law. For Plato, this freedom is equivalent to self-mastery, attained when reason rules the appetites in pursuit of the form of the good. This ethical freedom, the ability to act independently of based impulses, is what Kant required for rational agency and moral responsibility. This inner moral standard, whether emerging from Plato's pure form of the good or Kant's pure reason, is the prerequisite for this dignity. The concept of aligning the will with this objective law later finds its theological successor in the pursuit of God in Christian philosophy. Without this universal, self-legislated moral framework, we actually remain slaves to biological drivers. By aligning our will with this internal objective law, we achieve a more ordered, dignified version of human life than we ever could by simply embracing our innate fragility. The practice for death is, in reality, a high-stakes practice for living well. It demands that we master our fears and appetites so they do not steer the ship. In the Platonic dialectic, the journey is often more important than the destination. Socrates is not a man who has lost his humanity. He is a man who has found a way to face his vulnerability with dignity rather than being crushed by it. Now, we're not going to let Plato completely off the hook here, right? Like, we must address also this degraded turn. We know from the Republic that when the drive toward the good is applied to the collective without the guardrails of modern technology or our specific historical context, it can lead to ideas we find abhorrent. You know, the dissolution of biological families, the ideal state over the fragile individual. But we must distinguish between the state's cold political engineering and the individual's ontological struggle. Nussbaum views these ancient ideals through a modern lens that often seeks to decolonize and treat values like gender or virtue as mere linguistic constructs. But there is a fundamental danger in this. If there is no objective point to life beyond our biological reactions, then we aren't truly living a human life of purpose. We are just reacting to our own biology. Socrates stated clearly that it is not fear that makes us courageous. A life that only values its own fragility is circular. It has no direction. Purpose requires a good that transcends us, a good that provides the orientation necessary to make the examined life worth living. Nussbaum may cherish the messiness of an incomplete life, but I contend that if we don't have something greater to struggle toward, to die for, we aren't truly human. We are just a collection of simple pleasures and biological impulses. The ancients understood that direction, and it gives us purpose. They spoke of things so high that our minds could not fully grasp them, precisely because that gap, the space between our fragility and the ideal, that is where human purpose is actually born. The Areopagus in the Prison. Arthur Herman's The Cave in the Light is a book I highly recommend. It presents a meticulously researched, though largely hypothesized, dramatized, binary framework that positions Plato and Aristotle as the foundational seeds of the divergent philosophical veins that have traveled through time and constructed our modern world. The impact that the author implies that both thinkers have made is truly incredible. For instance, on a macro scale, Herman suggests that Plato's intellectual legacy eventually blossomed into ideals of communism. Aristotle's paved the way for democracy. It is absolutely one of my favorite books. It was within these pages that I first encountered the striking imagery of Paul standing above Socrates' cell to proclaim the New Testament. 400 years after Socrates drank the hemlock, a different man stood on the Areopagus, the rocky hill in Athens where the city's most serious legal cases were heard. The man was a Jew from Tarsus, a tent maker by trade, a Roman citizen by birth, and a former persecutor of Christians who had been struck blind on the road to Damascus and emerged as the most influential missionary in history. His name was Paul. Paul had walked through the Athenian agora, past the same colonnades where Socrates once questioned politicians and poets. He had seen the altars to every conceivable god, including one inscribed, "To an unknown god." The Athenians, Paul observed, were very religious, a word that could mean either reverent or superstitious, leaving his auditors uncertain whether they were being complimented or accused. And then Paul said something that the cultured Athenians found either absurd or sublime. He told them that this unknown God, the one they worshipped without knowing, had made the world and everything in it, that this God did not dwell in temples made by human hands, nor need anything from human hands, that in this God we live and move and have our being. A line that borrowed from the Stoic poet Aratus, adapted to Christian proclamation. But here's where Paul departs from everything the Phaedo taught. He announced that this God had appointed a day of judgment, and that the proof of this judgment was that God had raised a man from the dead. The Greeks, lovers of the soul's immortality, could accept that the soul survives the body, but resurrection, the body itself rising, transformed from the grave, that was a different matter entirely. Some mocked, others said, "We will hear you again about this." Paul departed unhindered, having planted a seed that would grow into the Christianization of the Greek philosophical tradition. The parallels between Paul and Socrates have not gone unnoticed by scholars. Loveday Alexander had argued that Luke, the author of Acts, structures Paul's missionary biography on a Socratic template. The Divine Commission, the Delphic Oracle for Socrates, the Damascus Road for Paul, the dialectical labor in the Agora, the series of trials, the imprisonment, the calm before death, Both men insist they are on a God-given mission. Both are guided by a divine voice. The daemonian for Socrates, the spirit for Paul. Both are accused of impiety. Both transform their interrogations into platforms for truth. What links them most deeply is the site itself. From the Areopagus, one can walk to the Agora in minutes. The same stones, the same light, the same merciless blue sky that blazed over Socrates' trial now arches over Paul's auditors. And just a few hundred meters from the Areopagus, in the southwest corner of the Agora, lies the structure that archaeologists believe may have been the state prison, the Desmoterion, where Socrates spent his final days. The Phaedo and the Areopagus speech thus stand as two responses to the same problem: how to face mortality without despair. Before we part, consider this. The Phaedo was written by a man who was not there. Plato could not bear to watch his master die. So he resurrected him in words, and those words have outlasted every prison, every poison, every empire that has tried to silence the questions they raise. The body dies in agony, but the dialogue lives. This is the ethos of the Phaedo. Not that death is nothing, but that the conversation about death is everything. What Socrates leaves us with is not a single doctrinal proposition, but a directed way of living in the face of death. The soul's fate after death is determined by how it has cared for itself in life. Those who have purified themselves through philosophy, disciplined reason, detachment from bodily pleasures, cultivation of virtue, will fare well in the afterlife, eventually reaching true reality. Those who have lived carelessly or tyrannically will suffer purification or permanent exile. But the final teaching, what Socrates does rather than merely says, is the practice of dying. At 67e through 68a, Socrates defines philosophy as practice for dying and death. By dying, he means separating the soul as far as possible from the body's distractions, opinions, and desires. The dialogue's closing scene at 118a shows this teaching embodied. Socrates, about to drink the hemlock, calmly asked Crito to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius, a thank offering for an examined life that was worth living.